Educate us. Teach us. We will learn from you. Awesome. All right, take it away.
So, thank you everyone for coming out instead of skipping out to the bar for a pint before the open spaces. Today I'm hoping to start a bit of a discussion with everyone about logging metrics and alerting systems and what they could look like. Also show you an implementation that I've been working on at Intent Media. But first, I'd like to start off with a bit of a promise. My promise is that by the end of this presentation, you will have seen a way to reduce complexity for your logging, metrics, and alerting systems. You will have seen an encapsulated system managed by the application owner. And you'll have seen a single source for your application and all of its support functions. So let's get started. At some point in many of our careers, someone has taken us off to the side and given us the stats talk. Sorry, omnigraphical and art isn't exactly my breadwinning skill. They might have shown us how a metrics collection system works, where you have multiple metric sources that are then collected and shipped to an aggregation target. Then they might have shown us how a log aggregation system works, where you have multiple log sources that are then collected and shipped to a log aggregation target. The problem is, as we measure, or as we mature into our careers, we learn that there's a lot more to these systems than what we learn in that talk. We see that the systems become very complex, especially as they start to intersect, where logs are driving metrics and vice versa. And then we try to make a change to the system. And we see that there are so many different interactions, and often these different parts are being owned by different teams, where you have ops that's owning the system metric stack, the collections and the aggregation targets, but then your individual application owners are owning their individual application output, or log and metric outputs. And to further complicate it, we've got two collection applications that are being shared by everything. For the devs in the room, this is a pretty bad smell if you were an object-oriented programmer. So what I'd like to talk about is a way that we can bring logging and metrics into the same system, how we can dry this up a bit, so as to reduce its complexity. And then we'll encapsulate the system using logical divisions to empower any individual from any team to make the changes they need to make to have a healthy and monitored system. In doing so, we start to get a sum or a whole that is greater than the sum of the parts. And lastly, I want to take all of this information with you and move it into our code base so that we have a single source of truth for all of our application configuration. So let's get started talking about logs. For a lot of us in the room, this is a very simplified way of looking at our log aggregation system. So I'm feeling like I've already been talking a bit too long and not typing enough. So let's not rock the boat too hard and start by implementing the same thing that you might already be working with. So, can everyone see? A little bit bigger? Let me see if I can do that. So this is a very trivial application. I'm sure everyone here who's already read or who can read Ruby has already noticed this is a fizzbuzz, where we're going to throw an error every time fizzbuzz is recorded, a warning every time buzz has been recorded, and an info every time fizz is recorded. And I'm going to put this into a container for ease of deployment. So let's build up our container and start it up. And you can see it's just logging fizzbuzz, nothing too special here. So let's talk about how we're going to grab the logs from this application. In the beginning here, we can see that we're tailing the log file as it comes from the Docker container. We're reformatting the log from its native JSON using FluentD. We're filtering the log to break it into the different warning levels. And then we're going to log it out to Papertrail. So let's get our FluentD implementation running and start our application. Let's see if we've got logs. And we'll give this a refresh. And we have logs. So for anyone who's ever implemented a system, this is probably a little bit more complex than you would think for building your own logging infrastructure. The value becomes when we start moving more of the system into this single configuration. So let's start talking about the metrics pipeline, because we're off to a great start, but I don't think I've really shown value yet. So here's our standard metrics gathering system. But as I mentioned before, we have that little bit of a smell in it. And when we put the two side by side, we can see that our application metrics and our application logs are both going through some type of collector. And there's really no division, or you can think of logs and metrics as having very little division because they are both a form of system information. So we're repeating ourselves by having a different collector for each one. So I'm going to rock the boat a little bit here and try to dry up the system. Now we're using a single system to perform a single function. We are gathering system information, running it through a single collector, and sending it to multiple aggregation targets. So let's take a look at what this would look like in practice. So we're going to start up another container, because I want to give it some time for metrics to generate. And you can see we're using a lot of the same code here. We're still generating logs. We're still reformatting them from JSON. But now, the same logs that we were initially shipping right out to Papertrail, we're actually copying. And for part of them, we're going to count the different types of logs that come out, whether they be error messages, fatal errors, warnings, info, or debug statements. And we're going to send this off at the bottom out to Librado. So let's take a look at Librado. And if we're very lucky, we will have. The unfortunate part of logs generation is that it does take a bit of time for this. Thankfully, we ain't got time for that. So now we're using the same collector, and we're generating both log data going to Papertrail and our metrics that are going directly into our metrics aggregation source, in this case, Librado. So great. I'm done 15 minutes early. We've got logging and metrics configured. But no system's really going to survive its first contact with users. So let's talk a little bit about alerting. For most alert systems, we have alerting set at the end of the process, being owned by third parties like Librato or like Papertrail or really anyone who you choose to use. And these alert configurations get strewn across all of the different services. So if you're looking for all of the alerts for a single application, you have to check each of these third-party services. So let's try moving alerting into that pipeline and show how we can put it in along with the code base, or into the code base, and see how alerting can be implemented into the stack. Sorry about that. It takes a moment to clean up. I unfortunately can't move the Biobu window, but I can bring it. Let me see if I can. So we've started up our FluentD container and again started up our application. And let's take a look at the configuration now now that we've added in alerting. You can see again, we're using the same sources as before, but now where we split out the configuration to perform a count, now we're also going to count the number of warnings over a 30-second interval, and emit a message if there's been more than 30 warnings over, a 10-second interval. And then if there's been any fatal or error messages, we're going to send an alert. As we move down further into our outputs, we'll see for the sake of this one, even though we've got our wonderful Papertrail and VictorOps people here, I chose to use Slack as our alerting target. So let's see what this looks like in Slack. And we can see that as our logs are generating these errors and warnings, we're getting alerted directly into Slack from the same configuration that's driving our logs, or log aggregation, and the same configuration that's driving our metrics. A single source for all of this information. So I've talked a little bit about how we could do this, and I've shown you a few demos. But I haven't really talked about why. Why would we want to keep this all together? Well, we have a simplified configuration. Now to handle any of the support functions of your application, you're writing in one DSL. And all of this information can be kept in one location alongside your application code. And you've separated the concerns. As you noticed, we've been working with one application, but as we spin up individual implementations of FluentD, each one could have or be for a separate application. So system information becomes encapsulated into a single process, and applications are no longer coupled to each other by the system they're running on. But really, all this just leads to empowerment. We've got no siloed ops team managing the single collection source. We've got a collective system ownership with the application developers and the folks who are creating and writing the system metrics and logging. We have no need to coordinate with other teams before making changes to your system information stack, and a freedom to try different tools. If we had wished to use any other if we had wished to switch to PagerDuty or VictorOps, we wouldn't have had a problem changing our alerting services because they're decoupled. But really, this is the reason that I keep coming in to work, is because we have this empowerment and this distribution of opportunity to work with different tools. So I would like to thank everyone who's been with the convention staff and our organizers who gave the opportunity to talk here. I'd like to thank the workflow innovation team that helped me work with all of these demos, specifically caching law, and everyone who's come and listened to me ramble. Can I take any questions? So if I can rephrase the question.
Repeat the question? Yeah.
Absolutely.
Thanks.
How would Logstash fit into a system like this? You could use Logstash as the target for your aggregation. You could also use a lot of what the system has created instead of Logstash. So you could be shipping messages or your messages to Logstash, which then handles its own system, or its own collection targets, or you could choose to forego Logstash and just use FluentD.
Other questions? We got mics now. Oh, no.
It's all right. It just gives us more open space time.
Yes, it does.
Great.
All right, let's
Thank
wrap.
you. Let's wrap it up.
All right, thanks very much, Will. Yep, we're all set. All right, how many people know what's next in the schedule? I see 2 hands and some people yelling open space. You are correct. We're doing open spaces now. Open spaces, as I've mentioned, this is your opportunity to build a community around here and actually start talking about the stuff that you care about. All right? So this is very, very important. You own this time. You own this afternoon. You need to make the most of it. I said so.